Union of the 12th Armored Division, and I'm sitting here in front of Gilbert Heine from the C Company of the 66th AIB. Let's just go ahead and get started and begin with growing up and where you were born and a little bit about your family.
Date and all that?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I was born on March the 17th, St. Patrick's Day, in the year 1923. And I was born in my grandfather's homestead, which was located about the middle of Nebraska. Within about a year after I was born, my parents had to move up to my grandfather's home, and then a year later my grandfather built a house for us on one of his farms in the Platte River Valley, and that's where I actually lived the majority of my life until I left for service. I grew up there, went to public school. I started at school when I was just 4 years old because I loved to read, and my mother was so distraught with me because I was constantly after her to get more books, and finally she talked to the public school teacher, and the teacher told her, well, send him to school. We'll take care of him there. So I started school early, graduated from public school when I was, it would have been 19. I was 12 years old when I graduated from public school, and 16 years old in March, and graduated in May from high school. So I was far too young to actually have graduated at that point, but I did. Anyway, then that was in 1939, and I spent most of my life up to that point, all of my life up to that point, on the farm there in Nebraska, and expected that that would probably be where I'd spend the rest of my life. But as it turns out, when the war broke out, the draft came along, and in 1942 I was drafted and sent to Fort Lewis, Washington, where I became a member of the 44th Infantry Division in the 44th Signal Corps, Signal Company, I guess, probably. And that company, I took basic training there. And apparently that was when I took a test also for the Army Specialist Training Program, ASTP, that you probably have heard a lot about. Anyway, when June rolled around, I was put on a train along with some other young men, and we traveled in ODs all the way down the California coastline across Texas in the summer of 1943. Hot, hot, hot. And we wound up in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where the temperature would be about 99 and the humidity would be about 110. And we were there for about 2 or 3 weeks living in the stadium under LSU at Louisiana State University Stadium. And then we received orders to go out to El Paso, Texas, to the College of Mines and Metallurgy. And that would have probably been about either the end of July, I don't know the exact date anymore, end of July or the 1st of August. And then I entered the Army Specialist Training Program. One of the things that they did was they threw everything at you full bore because they figured you either made it or you were out. Well, when I went through high school was so easy for me. I never studied, and I didn't really understand algebra because I had passed simply by being smart enough to remember what the teacher had said and writing the tests on that basis. Well, when I got to ASTP, that didn't cut it anymore. And if it weren't for one of my good friends who's in the 134th here of the 12th Armored, 134th Ordnance, he was a math wizard, and he was my bunkmate and roommate. And between the two of us, we finally got me zeroed in on what math was. And I learned how to handle it And so I went from there then through the various stages of trigonometry and Calculus 1 and Calculus 2, and made it, which amazed me. Anyway, and I learned to love math, which is an interesting thing. Anyway, we were there then from August of 43 until March of 44 when they turned the program down. And they sent, I was among those many who then were sent to the 12th Armored Division. And even though we'd been studying engineering for the last 9 months, we got put in the infantry, or at least I did. Some of the guys didn't. Wound up in the infantry, 66th. That's where I went overseas.
So let's go back a little bit. Did you, you said you went to El Paso. Did you meet George Messer at that point, or did he go through that at the same time?
I never knew George in school. There were, at mines, there were probably 250 to 300 guys, and they were divided into platoons. One platoon lived down in the dormitories. 2 platoons lived up underneath the stadium in old barracks. They had barracks just moved in underneath there. And the first 3 months I was there, I lived in the dorm, and that's where I met some of the guys like Dale Klein and others that are members of the 12th Armored, or became members. But George I didn't know. Let's see, some of the ones I did know were Bill Giannopoulos, and one is now gone already. He passed away with cancer here a couple of years ago. Elton Samuels was his name. Those are some of the names that I recall. I'm down there.
So you went through ASTP, and that was about a year, a little over a year?
Not quite a year.
Not quite a year.
About 9, just a little less than 9 months. We were almost through the 3rd quarter when they sent us a Dear John letter, and didn't. After that, you know, they just immediately moved us out.
How did you feel about that?
Oh, I guess at the time, you know, I was disappointed that we couldn't continue it, but at that stage of your life, you're not really, you don't make a big issue of things like that. You just take it as a part of the way in which life is and make the best of it, and that's what we did. Even winding up in the infantry, I didn't think too much about that. I thought, well, it'd be nice if I could have got into one of the other companies, because I knew the infantry would be the one that would be that or the tanks would be the ones that would be the most likely cannon fodder. And I didn't really appreciate being that. But my father was a World War I infantryman, and I kind of liked the idea of following in his footsteps. He was over in France and Germany during World War I. So.
Did he have any advice when you were drafted?
Not really. Dad wasn't the kind of guy, you know, that was likely to tell you a whole lot. He more or less said, take care of yourself, and that was it.
All right, so from ASTP you went where?
To the 12th Armored.
Right.
And they took us in, about the only thing I remember is a short train ride, you know, from El Paso over to Barkley. And once we got there, we were all herded into this big auditorium and lined up and told that we would be interviewed. And when we were interviewed, they asked us what we wanted to do, and then they told us to go in the infantry. They didn't listen to what we wanted to do at all. I think that was formality more than anything else. And I wound up in C Company of the 66th. And for my part, you know, some felt that there was a lot of resentment from the old-timers that were a part of the cadre and so forth. I don't recall that as being a real strong influence in my life. I know that there were incidents where we had to march around the mess hall in full pack, and we had to serve on KP and so forth. But most of those were just sort of at the whim of the first sergeant, as opposed to something that we did wrong or done wrong that we had to be punished for or anything like that. So I thought I fit in rather well.
Did you have any experiences with the local people of Abilene?
Not a lot. We did go into, a couple of times we went into town to the USO, and there were always about 10 guys for every girl, so if you wanted to dance with someone, you know, you waited your turn, and usually if you got 2 dances out of a whole night, you were lucky. Never got into any homes or anything like that. Most of the guys who did that were people who were married, and many of them were married at that time and had poor living accommodations in the town of Abilene. Either somebody's home, or some cases just a shack out back, or some cases a back porch or something like that, where they had to make do for a home for a young married couple. That's kind of tough, I thought.
Okay, so then you go to Camp Shank?
Yes, we left Barkley in August of '44 and went to Shanks, and we were there for a short time, wasn't very long, and then we shipped overseas on the Empress of Australia, which was an old British ship, and I was part of the group who served on KP the entire distance over. And as a result, we ate fairly well because we could pick and choose the food we wanted, but we had to endure that horrendous smell of cooked mutton all the time coming out of those limey kitchens. And the only advantage we had was that when we served the officers, we could slip a little of their food off and come back and eat it later on. That kind of gave us a little variety in the kind of food that was being served on the way across. And at night, we were responsible for cleaning up then, and we'd always have to dump the garbage over the fantail, and then we'd sit out there and enjoy the moonlight and the beautiful quiet seas. We really never had a lot of rough seas going over. The biggest problem we had was that we did have a couple of U-boat scares, and we also had a huge convoy. I have no idea how many ships were in that convoy, but every direction that you looked, you saw ships. And some of them were way out on the horizon, some of them in closer. And whenever there was a U-boat scare, of course, well, then the smaller battleships would come in and start dropping depth charges, which were always interesting because you'd see the water flying up in the air where those depth charges would explode.
So evidently you didn't get seasick.
No, I didn't. That's something that has never bothered me. When I came home on a Liberty ship, and that thing was bucking almost like a Western Bronco. The seas in the spring of the year, this was in June of '46 when I came home, and during that time, the sea is as rough as it ever gets. And that prop would come out and shake the whole ship, you know, when it came out of the water. But it didn't bother me any. I didn't get sick from it. We went overseas then, and it took us about, as I remember, it was somewhere between 10 days and 2 weeks to get across, because it took a long time for those convoys they didn't go very fast, and they did a lot of zigzagging and maneuvering in order not to give anybody any straight shots at any ships. The Empress of Australia carried about 5,000 troops, if I remember. So that would be about half of our division. The 12th Armored normally would carry a strength of about, somewhere over 10,000, I think. And the 5,000 would just be about half of that, so there must have been another ship that was carrying part of those guys, although there was an advance party that went over too.
So you landed
in England, Southampton, and went to the Salisbury Plain, where near the town of Tidworth, and you've probably heard this before. The Salisbury Plain we lived in, I believe they were 6-man huts, either 4 or 6. It seems to me like they were 6-man huts. And they had a little, it was a cone-shaped stove that sat right in the middle of the tent, and you'd get a bucket of briquettes. They looked like charcoal briquettes that you could use for heat, and that would last all of 2 hours. And then the other 22 hours you froze because it was cold, and the temperature was in the low 30s, I think, and the humidity was very, very high, so that it was not a very comfortable place to be. But I did get a weekend pass to go into London, and during the day you could get around and see quite a bit. We went to Westminster Cathedral and to Buckingham Palace and different places like that, that were worth seeing on the tourist agenda. But at night you couldn't do anything because everything was pitch black, and you couldn't get into the if you didn't know where you were miserably lost. And we didn't usually stay in town too long. I think they'd let us go on Friday, and then we'd get Saturday and Sunday. We had to be back Sunday night. So we'd get 2 nights and 2 days in London. That was the extent of that. But then we left Salisbury and shipped out to cross the English Channel in the evening. In November, early November, and landed at the Havre, where we got trucks and everybody and tracks. I think we rode 6x6s, if I remember correctly, to that first point and then we were there for about a week or so, something like that, several days, during which time that the armor caught up with us, the half tracks and other things that we were going to be using caught up with us at that point. Then we were committed into action, and I remember that we relieved the 4th Armored Division. That was Patton's division at that time, and they were seasoned veterans, and we walked into their position and took over where they were. At little towns, there were several little towns, Binning, B-I-N-N-I-N-G, and right now the names don't want to come to me. There were some other little towns that were in that same area where we had our first baptism of fire. And we lost quite a few people, comparatively speaking, during that time. Very easy to do because, shells come in and guys aren't used to that kind of thing, and first thing you know, guys are being killed here and there throughout the division. And most of them in the infantry, because the tanks, they weren't quite as susceptible to that as we were. They had for that kind of fighting, they were fairly well protected. Tree bursts and things of that way didn't bother them. Most of our time then was spent in this area, and the Siegfried and Maginot lines. The Maginot line was one of our objectives because that's where the Germans were fighting back and forth. Once we crossed that, then we were more into battling, like the Battle of the Bulge and that sort of thing. The Maginot line probably after December was where that kind of caved in, and from that point on then we moved on toward Herlesheim became one of our key periods on January 16th of 1945.
So what was your first experience that you remember in actual battle?
I suppose those first battles at Binning, I remember those very well because it was so wet, and the tanks had cut deep tracks, and you'd try to march up carrying all of your equipment and your rifle and everything, and you'd find yourself falling down, stumbling over one another. You know, the walking was anything but good, and of course we lost some of our company men at that point, and losing those was sort of a traumatic experience because you'd never done that before and lost anybody in battle, and losing friends is always traumatic. Nothing compared to January the 16th, because that was the time when our major battle took place. And that was the time when the company lost a goodly number of the people. I was one of the small number. Well, out of A Company and C Company, there was about 65 people who were still left after that battle. And that's 2 companies, so that's 500 men. Well, some of those men, of course, were not involved in it. What have we got?
Just a minute. Sounds like somebody hit the fire alarm or something. Yeah. Okay. But you just be comfy. We'll adjust once we get started. You be comfy. Don't worry about it. Okay. Because we could adjust this.
Okay.
All right, we're back after a small break. And just a reminder, we were talking about the battles that he is involved in, and we'll let you continue that on.
Okay. When you hear people talk about the January the 16th, 1945, you're going to get all kinds of opinions as to what took place, and even some different opinions as to when it took place. And I'm sure that I, like everyone else, have my own small perspective of that day. I happened to be in the 3rd platoon, the 3rd squad, which meant that and we went in formation that day with company commander, Lieutenant Joseph, and the 1st, 2nd, 3rd platoons right in order. We were marching up, and that's normally the way we fell in. That's the way we were going. As we approached that woods, the company turned, and as they turned, we sort of presented where we had been presenting just a very narrow front. We now presented a very wide front where we were turning. And the 3rd platoon, 3rd squad was on the back side of that, clear on the right-hand side as we approached the woods. So when the machine gun fire broke out, the targeted area was more to our front and left than it was where we were. There was machine gun fire there, but not nearly the extent of it that there was in the other part of the company. As a result, many of the fellows were pinned down in that occasion. We were also pinned down, but we were able to move, especially before it got daylight, because after it became daylight, then the snipers started zeroing in. But before daylight, we got in, we must have been about 6 o'clock in the morning when we hit this position, and it was still dark until more likely about 8 or 8:15 before it got daylight enough so that they could see any distance. During that time, we were able to pull back to what I choose to call irrigation laterals. They were just little little ditches, which were about, maybe 3 feet wide or 4 feet wide. And they were probably a foot and a half or 2 feet deep. And they varied in depth depending on where you were. But when you got down in them, you could get out of the line of fire of the machine guns. And until the daylight came, you were pretty much protected there. After daylight, of course, the snipers up in the trees could still get a pretty good angle of fire into those ditches. But we pulled back into that, and we didn't know what was going on, didn't know what was happening, didn't have anybody telling us what was happening. The radio people were off. The radio man was with the first part of the company, and they were pinned down out there, although some of the radio men hadn't come into this area at all. They were still out back. So we really weren't getting any information except what we get out of those little old telephones that we used to carry around. I don't know if you are familiar with that or not, but they, battery operated, and you'd whirl them to get the battery. And anyway, no one knew what was happening. So we stayed there for a period of time, and then when it got daylight, they said, well, set up return fire. Well, as soon as we did that, then we drew fire. And some of our company, one man particularly by the name of Charlie Chilcutt, had a light machine gun, air-cooled machine gun, and he was lying beside me with that machine gun firing, and all of a sudden he just flopped over on his back, and he had a bullet hole right between his eyes. Some sniper had zeroed in on him, and that was the end of Charlie. Well, that gave us cause to not want to be crawling up on that bank and zeroing in or trying to get any field of fire with machine guns. So we stayed back. But at that point, we had guys who were lying out on the field, on that flat area out ahead of us, who had been injured. And so somehow we had to get some of those men out of there, which occurred then in the next period of time. I don't remember the details of that because I've always been convinced that the Lord made us so that we could block out those bad things when they occurred, and we didn't have to remember them. And apparently that's what he did to me, because they gave me a silver star for having saved some of those fellows, dragging them out of there, but I don't remember doing it. I don't remember who they were. I have no idea how it happened or anything. Others who apparently saw it happen said that it did happen. That's sufficient for me, because I don't want to know any more about that. All I know is that that was one bad day. We finally, toward evening, were asked to withdraw, or told to withdraw. We withdrew to I think it must have been along that river that was there, Zorn River. And when we withdrew to the Zorn River, we set up, we were told to dig in, which was almost an impossible task, because it had 6 inches of snow on the ground and everything was covered. And so many of those guys were lying out there in the snow during the course of this whole thing. So, but we did dig in, and we spent the night on that bank that night. That was the night of the 16th. The morning of the 17th, there was an effort made to make another effort to win this back, but B Company had been brought forward then, and they moved through us, and we were told that we were going to be accompanying them. Well, B Company never got any further than we did, and so we were never brought out of that reserve position. But toward evening, some of the people started to move out and to withdraw. I don't remember exactly whether we withdrew on that night of the 17th or the morning of the 18th. It doesn't, in my own mind, I don't seem like I spent another night out there. It was just that first night of the 16th. It's possible that it was 2 nights, because the whole thing, you know, becomes one of those things that your mind likes to be rid of, and so it just flat out blacks it all out for you. We withdrew some to Hort, H-O-E-R-D-T, and some to, there was a town called Niederschäfelsheim, which is a German town, a small German town. That's where we started out from that morning of the 16th. Some of us came back to that place, and of course we were very disorganized. We only had about 35 people out of that whole group that went in that were left at that point. George Carpenter and Lundeen, Engstrom, those were some of our sergeants in the 3rd platoon, because we were fortunate that we were on that far end, and so we avoided some of the mass slaughter that occurred on these other in the other part of the company. They were some of those who were still capable of organizing or getting us back into the Army's structure, so to speak. And of course then the reorganization took place, and the reorganizing consisted of naming new people. I was made a staff sergeant and given a squad in the 2nd platoon. I moved from 3rd platoon to 2nd platoon. I don't remember all of the people who came into the other platoons. Some of the people who came back out with us were not promoted at all. They stayed where they were for one reason or another. I have no idea why that was. And all of the, what we call repos, started coming in, the people who were going to be replacements for us. And they came in varying amounts. We got few one day and a few another day. Then we get a big bunch of them. We finally got enough people in to get our strength back up. And then we started to do maneuvers and so forth to get these people trained so that we could go back into combat, which we did then, the first part of February, when we made the drive to Colmar. And I was a squad leader going on the trip to Colmar, on the drive down there. And my squad was given scout responsibilities, which means that we were out ahead doing the scouting so that we didn't run into ambush or anything like that. And we were the first ones to get into Colmar because of that. And then, of course, I had well, my whole squad was new, as I recall. There weren't any guys coming back that were with us previous to that time. And the Colmar deal, I had a scout for my squad was a man by the name of Chuck Carlson. And he and I were 2 of the ones who were first ones in, because we were moving the squad into Colmar. We captured a German soldier, and we asked him where the Krauts were, and his response was, well, they're all moved out now. They've withdrawn. And so then Lieutenant Hused, who had been assigned to us after we got our table of reorganization back, he was the one who went in to shake hands with the French commander that was coming in on the other side. Then we were immediately moved out of Colmar and sent on down to Rohrfach, I believe it was, R-O-H-R-F-A-C-H, a little town further south that was supposed to close the gap. And we did that. Then the 66th was selected as the representative in the big victory parade that was held in Colmar. And we were the ones who rode the half-tracks, you know, through the town of Colmar, waving at the people and getting waved at. So after Colmar, we were moved back up to training again. You have to, when you're bringing in new men, you have to have a period of acclimation where these people are trained as to what their job is and how they're supposed to work and so on and so forth, and you had a lot of that. You'd get 2 weeks free from the battle, and you spend all that time just in training. And we did that on a couple of occasions during the course of the next month or so. And we ran into battles. We were back up at another place called Rufach, R-O-U-F-A-C-H, Rufach, which is north of the area where we had been, Herlesheim, Gamsheim area. And I remember that so distinctly because the Germans had begun using these Werfel guns, which were like huge tubes mounted on the tops in banks of about 8 or 10 on the tops of their tanks. And they'd fire those things, and they would just sound like a kind of a big old when those things would fire, and of course they'd explode on the other end. But they were firing into this Rufach area, and we were getting tree bursts. The shells would explode up in the trees, and then shrapnel would come down, hitting the people below. And we were in that forest, and we were being shelled with those things. So that's kind of a miserable period of time for us. But from there we went to Trier, which was the beginning of the drive on the Rhine. And on March 17th of 1945, on my 22nd birthday, we kicked off from Trier. And the next 3 or 4 days or 5 days, whatever it was, we never stopped. We just went without hesitation, constant, no stopping to eat, no stopping to make camp or to set up evening, night perimeter or anything like that. It was just a constant go until you get to the Rhine River, because they wanted to surprise the Germans there. And our goal, our objective was Ludwigshafen. There were some going down to Speyer and some going north of Ludwigshafen. I don't remember the town that was their objective there. But when we hit there, we hit real resistance. And it took quite a while. There were a lot of tracks lost, a lot of tanks lost in that battle to secure that area. But we were able to do it. Then we stayed there for a few days until we crossed the Rhine at Worms on a pontoon bridge. And when we crossed the Rhine, shortly thereafter, we went back. We were in the Third Army during all this time, from Trier across. We reverted back to the 7th Army, and then we began the drive toward Würzburg, up toward Nuremberg, and then down toward Ansbach and Munich, and from Munich on over to Austria. And of course, you had your times when that was relatively quiet, and you had your times when it was all kinds of banging and cracking. Lots of, we lost guys at Hettstadt, which is between Würzburg and I was a staff sergeant at this time. When we got to Hettstadt, the guy who was my platoon sergeant, George Carpenter, was wounded and captured. So then I became the platoon sergeant at that point. I was the platoon sergeant from then on, sometimes with and sometimes without a platoon leader, because officers were going here and going there, and they'd be with you for a short time and then they'd be gone. We wound up then down on the Austrian border, and at that time I had received orders from my company commander, Captain Fox, that I was to receive a battlefield commission, or he didn't tell me that. He told me I was to report back to our division headquarters, and when I got back there, they gave me a battlefield commission and took me, discharged me from the enlisted Army and re-enlisted me in the Army as a second lieutenant. And I then...
What date was this?
This would have been at the end of the war. I left the company while they were still in near Augsburg. My papers say that I was discharged and enlisted as an officer in May of 1945. So would have been right at the end of the war. And then I stayed with my company. I came back to the same platoon that I left, 2nd platoon of C Company. And George Carpenter, who had been injured and who had left the company, came back as my platoon sergeant then, when I just went from staff sergeant over the top of him to the platoon leader, and he came back then during that time that he was gone. It was kind of interesting to have him back again, and we had a very collegial relationship. We had a lot of respect for one another and thought a great deal of one another, and as a result we had no problems with rank and all that kind of stuff. And I stayed then with the 12th Armored until the war in the Far East began to escalate, and they thought they were going to need more people there. Then they transferred me out of the 12th. When I became an officer, I didn't have enough points at that time in order to qualify me to go back home. I did as an enlisted man, but not as an officer. So they sent me first to the 36th Infantry Division, which is a Texas division, down at Ulm, Germany. And I was there for about 2 weeks. And then from there they sent me over to Marburg. And I always thought Marburg was in France, but a friend of mine that I met there, who was also a 2nd lieutenant at that time, one of my high school buddies, told me that he thought it was in Germany. So wherever it was, we went back there where that was what they called a staging area for rehabbing people, to send them back to states to retrain them for the other type of activity that they fought in the Far East. And it was while we were there that the bomb was dropped on Japan, and the war ended. So then somebody looked at my MOS number, and they said, "Hey, you have an engineering MOS." I said, "Yes, I've had that for a long time." "Well," he said, "what are you doing in the infantry?" I said, "Well, that's a question that I could never answer for you, but I wished it had been answered a long time ago." But he sent me then to the 970th Engineer Maintenance Company, where I would be attached to them. I was part of that company, assigned to them, I should say. And then as a part of my assignment, I was put on TDY to bring in the companies that were being disbanded and dismantled, and then take all their equipment and all their I'd clean out their manpower base, send those guys back to the States, take all their equipment, put it into storage, and then process all their papers. And I did that with, I think, about 3 or 4 different companies over the period of the time that I was there. And finally then at the end, I was brought back to the 970th Engineer Maintenance Company as a company commander. And it was as company commander then that I received my orders. I was called into 7th Army headquarters in Heidelberg, and while I was there, they called me in to promote me to captain, and the orders for coming home came through at the same time. And so he said, "You have a choice. If you'd like to go home, you can, but you go home as 1st lieutenant. If you want to stay here for another 3 months, we'll make you a captain." I said, "I'm not interested in being a captain. I'm interested in going home." So they sent me home then in June of '46, and I arrived stateside, went through the separation center at Fort Leonard Wood, and wound up at home then. In my actual separation from service didn't take place until the end of July, because I had that much time accumulated for leave. That's the story of my
Did
Army.
you have, what experiences did you have with the local people, either during the war or after?
Well, during the war, most of my experience with the local people came after the war ended. We were the Army of Occupation, and as a platoon leader, second lieutenant at that time, I had an area that I was responsible for, and I would set up guards, and we would go out and patrol those areas. This was all during the non-fraternization time. You weren't supposed to be fraternizing with any of the German people, and so we would only be talking to burgomeisters or people who were in authority in the towns, and or we would, since we lived in homes, sometimes there would be the people who owned the home might be used as caretakers and also as cooks for you, if you, especially for the officers. And so we would come in contact with those people, but that was the extent of that. I never had a lot of contact with the German people.
Did you have any involvement with concentration camps or POW
Yes, I
camps?
did. I was one of the people who was, my platoon was the first one into Landsberg after we crossed. And I have arguments with my fellow members of the 66th, because they maintain that the different location than what I have in my mind. But I think that there may have been two areas there. One was an area where they held GIs, and a number of our people were kept there. That was on a different location than the concentration camp at Landsberg. And the Landsberg concentration camp, from the way I recall it, was after we crossed the bridge. We were told, you know, go. That was the concept of armor. Get out there, and you're supposed to be the point for this thing. So we would go, and as we went, we ran into this camp. And it was a camp for Jewish and DPs, displaced persons. And when we arrived at the camp, we went through the gate, and there were very few people who were alive. I would say that there could have been over maybe 3 or 4 people who were alive who came out of those buildings that were in the background. They didn't know what was going on. There were stacks of bodies located in the front area of this display, of this camp. And that, you know, in my mind, is just as clear as can be. I saw those bodies there. And I remember seeing a couple of guys looking out of the buildings and coming out and wondering what the heck's going on out there, because they didn't know we were coming and we didn't know they were there. But the orders that came down to us immediately, don't stop, keep moving, keep moving. So we pulled out right away. Well, all we did was we said, there's more people coming. And we pulled out and went on down the road. But who came next, I don't know, because I've had different guys from different units tell me, well, we came in there and there was all these people coming out all over the place. Well, that had to be after they were alerted, because they had to know, well, this is a group of people that are finding us here and wanting to release us from this captivity that we're in. And so I'm convinced that our time there was the way I remember it, and that we moved on simply because orders were, get going. You're supposed to be the point for this outfit. Get out there and keep this column moving, because the people that came, and very many times, you know, the point would be well ahead of the main line. We could be as many as 20, 25, 20, I remember one time 26 miles ahead of the main force out by ourselves. Lots of Germans behind us, lots of Germans around us, lots of Germans in front of us. But that's the way armor worked. And we were doing the thing we were supposed to do. We got pounded pretty good. You know, the 88s and so forth would be coming in with great frequency on occasion.
Okay, so once you became stateside, what did you do, and did you work? Did you play?
After I came back home?
Yeah.
Well, I went home, and my parents were still on the farm, and I had every intention of being a farmer. And I had two of my father's friends who said, well, when Gilbert gets home, you send him over. I want him to farm one of my farms. And that's what I intended to do. But this was June and July. And June and July, you don't start farming. That's way too late. That's when you're thinking more in terms of the harvest is coming up for too much longer. So I thought, well, I'm not going to sit around here and have nothing to do, so I decided I'd go to school. GI Bill would give me some free schooling, so I went down to the University of Nebraska and intended to enroll in the Ag College there. And in the meantime, a friend of mine that I'd known was attending a smaller college called Concordia Teachers College at Seward, Nebraska. And I gave her a ride down there, and when I dropped her off, I told her I'd pick her up at that same spot. When I came back that afternoon, I drove in, and the president of this small college was standing out there visiting with her. He asked me what I was going to do, and I said, well, I'm going to go down to the university and take a few courses before next spring when I start farming. Well, I said, you know, courses you take at this stage of the game are probably going to be more or less the same thing you could take right here. He said, why don't you come here and take them? Oh, I said, I don't think I'd be interested in that. It didn't sound like the thing I'm interested in. Well, he said, think about it. Well, I went home, and this was a young lady that I'd picked up. She said, well, you know, that wouldn't be a bad thing for you to do. You could take the same courses there. So I did. I ended up changing my mind. I went to school there. After I'd gone there a semester, I decided I liked it a lot better than I thought I would. So I continued there and got my degree. And my wife now had graduated there the previous spring, and she was teaching at that time. So then that next summer, 1947, we got married, and then I completed my degree work there and started teaching. And I taught for about 5 years, I guess. And at the end of that 5-year period, my father-in-law had suffered a heart attack. And he was a big farmer out in central Nebraska and had no one to take over his operation, so I was the only one that was mobile. So I said, okay, we'll do it. So we went out and took over his place until one of his other sons got out of the service. And when he came home, then I went out on my own father's farm and started operating that. And I stayed there 10 years. And then this college where I had attended called me and wanted to know whether I would be interested in joining the faculty. And I said, well, I haven't been teaching. They said, well, that's all right. We think you have some other things that we'd like to tap into. So I went back and became a member of that faculty in 1964, and I stayed there until 1987 when I retired. And I retired then, and during that time I became we called them deans at that time because they were still into the process, dean of advancement and assistant to the president, and that's the way I retired from there in '87. And when I retired then, I waited a couple of years for my wife, who was also teaching, for her to retire, and then we joined an organization called Laborers for Christ that builds churches all over the country. And I still am associated with them. I'm a regional consultant and a member of their national board of directors. And that brings me up to date. Well, I can tell you a little bit about my family.
Yes, please.
I have 2 children. My daughter is married to a director of Christian education in Topeka, Kansas, and she has one son who is almost 30 years old, and will soon be the proud father of a little one, be our great-granddaughter or grandson, whatever it turns out to be. Then I have a son who is a pastor in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, who is in Sheridan, and he has 4 children, the oldest of whom is, oldest of which is a student at West Point. She's a plebe at West Point. This is her first year, and she plans to graduate from West Point and stay in the Army for 5 years. And she says that her grandfather was one of the big influences in her life. So that makes me feel pretty good.
Yeah, I bet.
And we have 3 other grandchildren there. They're all, in our eyes, of course, great grandchildren. One of them is a swimmer who has broken all of the records in the Wyoming district, Wyoming state, and who we hope one day we might see in the Olympics. She's really good.
Neat.
My wife is still with me. We've been married 52 years now, and very happy. We love the Wyoming area. Pure air, lots of sunshine. People say, oh, it's awful cold there, but it really isn't. The dry air is such that you don't feel that cold nearly like you do in the humid parts of the country. Warm, if sun's shining, it's warm, no matter the temperature. That's about it.
That's great.
Brings us up to date.
Yeah, it is. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Well, it's nice to be here.
It was a great story.
I've had a lot of activities that I've participated in over the years. I have the privilege to serve it as.
Yeah.
It's a windy state when you're down south,
Yeah.
but when you're up north, you know, you don't, if we get a 10-mile-an-hour breeze, they think we've got a bad wind. So we live in that pocket. Bighorns are to the west and the south, and we're right in that pocket in there. So we really don't notice the cold and the wind at all. We get a little chilly weather on occasion, but it's not that noticeable.
Tell me about your association.
Well, in 1974 was the first time I attended a meeting or a reunion of the 12th Armored Division. Since that time, I've only missed 2. One of them was the next year, in 1975. It was in Philadelphia. The other one was last year at Houston because my wife had a mastectomy, and we were moving on October the 1st, so it was just not possible to get down there. I became active in the association probably about, maybe around 1977 or 78, along in there, because I'm usually the kind of person who likes to get involved, which I did. And I began my tour of duty through the chairs. I served on the board of directors. Then I became second vice president and first vice president. And in 1983, I was elected to, I believe it was 83, I was elected as president. Then I served in 84 as president. And in 85, I was reelected then for a second term as president. Then, of course, you taper down with the activity in the board and on the executive council and so forth. And I've been associated, well then in 1987, I guess it was, or 86, maybe it was 86, they asked me if I would serve as executive secretary. I believe it was a little later, it must have been about 87, as executive secretary. And I took on that responsibility and kept it for about 3 or 4 years until I became active with this laborers program. And that took more of my time than I had anticipated. And so then I continued with it instead of with the executive secretary's job. And that was when Bob Head then took over as exec.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Okay.